Good evening, good late evening to everyone. First of all, welcome to the New York Climate Week. Envipol is organizing its first event at the New York Climate Week this year. And the event is something that concerns us all, has been specifically curated, but the topic would not be the theme that it is that we're discussing today, climate mitigation through environmental policy. Enviropolicy would not have been possible without the panelists that we have with us today across dimensions and themes that they cover in their expertise. Before I move on to their introductions, which we'll try and keep short because we have a lot of discussion to fill in the next 1 hour. I just wanted to quickly introduce Envipol to all of you. I'm sure some of you have heard of it in Asia and in the Indian subcontinent. But Envipol is basically a consultancy that tries to bridge the gap between policy gaps and sustainability. And we do these things through various verticals. So there's compliance structures, there's systems design thinking, there's education and skill development, and most importantly, and because a lot of us are lawyers at Envipol, policy review and analysis. So that's what we try and do within the environmental and energy sphere. As part of the education skill development vertical of Envipol, we really do think that creating awareness and creating positive dialogue towards the issues that are happening globally and not just hyper-locally are issues that need to be talked about, that need to be promoted through events and through global audiences that we're trying to achieve through today's New York Climate Week event. So just a quick thank you to all our partners, Global Policy Insights, New York Climate Week, the Climate Group, and we're glad to be having this event at the start of the week. So with that done, and that's as short a description of Envipol as I could have fit into this 1 hour of discussion. I'll quickly move on to the structure of today's event. As I mentioned, climate mitigation through Enviropolicy is our theme for the event, in which we have 2 panel discussions. This is the main event where we have Dr. Christina Voigt, Professor John Tobin, we have Dr. Cosmin Corendea, Dr. Oliver Ruppel, also Dr. Professor John Tobin. I'm sorry, I missed the doctorate there, John.
Oh, don't worry about it.
So we have all 4 of them as part of the main panel discussion, where we will be discussing the main theme, which is the overarching theme of the panel. And the event, which is climate mitigation through Enviropolicy. This would be a 1 hour panel discussion, and then we'll quickly switch over to our next panel discussion, which is being where we have panelists from the GPODS fellowship that Envipol runs. And these fellows have been chosen from across 30 countries across the globe. We have mentors coming in from around 35 countries who come and interact with these fellows. So that specific event, after an hour of this discussion, would be on sustainable mobility and generally the transport sector at the global and the local level, and how that could be made a little more climate friendly, to put it in extremely simplistic terms. So with that being said, I'll just quickly introduce the panel today for the main event. And it is my absolute pleasure to welcome Professor Dr. Christina Voigt. She wears many hats, and all of our panelists do, but she is the chair of the Climate Change Specialist Group of the IUCN World Commission on Environmental Law. She is a member of the IUCN Climate Change Task Force of the IUCN. She's also a professor of law at the University of Oslo. She has worked extensively in everything that is affecting us climate-wise. All the positive policy developments that have happened at the global level, she has had some part to play in that discussion and what has transpired for each of us. So thank you, Christina, for being with us. We have Professor Dr. John Tobin, and I have corrected myself this time around, from Cornell University, whose recent work focuses on corporate sustainability, including the management of environmental, social, and reputational risks, stakeholder engagement and communications, business ethics, sustainable strategy, and development of financial products and services that aim to address broad societal challenges. He has also worked extensively on biodiversity, and his recent paper that we have been studying for the past few days now. We'll try and circulate it on our chat boxes. I'm sure all of you would benefit from giving it a quick read whenever you do have the time. That was all for all the participants. Thank you, John, for being with us. And it's an absolute pleasure to have you from Ithaca. So Christina is joining us from Oslo. John is in Cornell currently in Ithaca. So thank you for joining us. Then we have Professor Dr. Cosmin Corendea. Cosmin is a very inspiring figure for all of us lawyers who want to become international lawyers, especially if you want to become international environmental lawyers and policy analysts. He basically devised the concept of international hybrid law. And he would be talking about environmental equity because he's also worked extensively on climate migration and how policies could be adapted in a real world sense to mitigate and prepare for climate change. Professor Corendea has worked extensively on the climate preparedness aspect of the sea level rise, especially in terms of Pacific Islands. Again, he has a book which is the seminal work on this topic, and I'd be happy to circulate the link to that book in the chat box. I'm sure all of you would enjoy the quick read that it is. And finally, and surely not the least of them all, we have Dr. Oliver Ruppel, Professor Dr. Oliver Ruppel of the Stellenbosch University. He specializes in international economic law, sustainable development law, and environmental law, with special focus on climate change. He served in the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and is member of Paris Implementation Working Group of the IUC and World Commission on Environmental Law. He also runs the oh, one second, let me just get this right. I remember the acronym, but I want to get this right. So he also is the director of the Development and Rule of Law program hosted by the Water Institute of the Stellenbosch University. So thank you so much, Dr. Ruppel, for joining us. What we intend to do through this discussion, as you can see from our diverse panelists, is to get both the bird's eye view and a specific prismatic view of the issues that we'd be dealing with over the course of this discussion, and possibly with the magnitude of the discussion over the next century. So no pressure with the discussion that we're planning to hold. And with that, I'll move over to Arpit, who's also the co-founder of Envipol, which is the organizer of this event, and also the chief strategic officer of the organization. So most of the work that happens in the minds of Arpit himself, and then it is executed by lesser humans like me. Arpit, over to you.
Thank you, Ishan, for building me up over there. But thank you, first of all, everybody, for joining us, and all of the people in the panel. It's an absolute pleasure. We'll start with our first question, wherein I would like to have quick responses, probably just a 2-minute of opening statement. And this is something, this is probably a very fundamental question that we've been dealing with, that is the infusion of capital, or, in much more simpler terms, is money the solution or the primary strategy for dealing with climate change or biodiversity? Because a lot of times the kind of solutions that we hear when there's a climate challenge or there's a biodiversity challenge, a lot of times the solutions are that governments, foundations should come together and infuse money in the system, and that seems to be the primary recommendation of many of the reports that we come across. So I would like to start with Professor Christina Voigt. If Christina, you could talk about that, and what are your views there?
Well, thank you all, and Ishan, for the kind introduction, and thank you also to Enviropolicy for inviting us and for conducting this very interesting discussion. Well, to your question, Arpit, is money the solution? I would like to step, one step back and say that what we are facing are unprecedented challenges, both in scale and in scope. We know we have to keep global warming to well below 2 degrees centigrades. We know that this involves keeping getting greenhouse gas emissions to global net zero by 2050. It's a global phase out of basically greenhouse gas emissions. And that in turn implies a global transformation. And a transformation are systemic changes involving both the economy, but also technology and social structures. So the money is part of the solution, but it's not the entire solution, and it cannot be. And another aspect that I wanted to highlight is that there is a lot of money available, but a lot of the money goes into the wrong direction. So I think first of all, we need to revisit and restructure the financial streams and financial structures and make sure that the money available is actually, supporting the cause we are all interested in, and it's not subsidizing the opposite, like subsidies to fossil fuel industries. And we all know that this is actually written into the Paris Agreement. Interesting, there's a lot of focus on the temperature goals, but the same article, Article 2, actually makes it as the purpose of the Paris Agreement to make finance flows consistent with a pathway towards low greenhouse gas emission developments. And I think this is a goal that needs to be reminded because it sometimes flies a little bit under the radar.
Right. Absolutely, absolutely. And I think we are going to get back to the point of how sometimes there is a lot of money available, but it's not being directed in the right places. So that's something that we'll pick up. But then same question to Professor John Tobin. John, what are your views on the subject?
Well, like Professor Dr. Voigt, I feel that financing is necessary but not sufficient. That's how I tend to think of financing. It is absolutely essential, but it is not enough to address the issues that we're trying to deal with. And don't get me wrong, money is crucial. And this is a point that I have tried to make most recently in a report that you referenced already in collaboration with the Nature Conservancy and the Paulson Institute. It's a report that we are calling Financing Nature. It is all about how do we deploy the necessary capital to address the crises, the twin crises of biodiversity and climate in nature. But a central point of the report is that both financing from governments, either in the form of foreign aid or official development assistance, or through national budgets in the wealthier countries, which, as it turns out, are often not the countries that are most important from a biodiversity point of view, at least. And in addition to governmental financing, private sector financing are going to be crucial to address the twin crises that we're looking to address. But we will have to have policy action in parallel to the deployment of that capital if we are really going to facilitate the deployment of the capital. Because without the enabling conditions in the form of policies that will facilitate the movement of capital from activities that harm nature and towards activities that will promote the long-term sustainable management of nature, we will not succeed no matter how much capital there is available. And one other point that I think I should like to highlight is the fact that it's not just about spending money. And as important as that might be, maybe equally important is not spending money. And what I mean to say with that is that if we deploy less capital in a manner that is harmful to nature, that means that we will also need less capital to restore the negative impacts we have had on nature. So while a lot of the focus of biodiversity finance, conservation finance, climate finance is on how do we spend more capital to address the issues, I'd like to emphasize the importance of spending less capital, but less capital in a manner that is harmful.
Thank you. Thank you. That's a great frame to understand this topic. That where do you not spend the money, and where do you spend less capital in order to be able to leverage that, or to do away with the extra capital that will be spent to offset the harms. Now, I would go with the same question to Professor Oliver Ruppel, and Oliver, if you could share your opening thoughts on that.
Well, a lot has been said already, and I don't want to duplicate our efforts here, but what is crucial is that we experience a systemic change. And that change must be in line with international obligations such as stipulated under the Paris Agreement. But in order to achieve those, we also have to start putting a price tag on something that we have neglected so far in the past. And that price tag is on nature itself. Nature capital is something that is of essence, because in the end, if we don't shift our anthropocentric approach towards the preservation of nature, which is the basis of everything, and not only of us as human beings, but of everything on this planet, then we have to put a price tag on this, and we need sticks and carrots in terms of incentive structures and punishment lines that will actually bring reason to human activities. And we cannot leave that to governments only, and we cannot leave that to the international community only. We need to get the industry on board in order to support this, in order to digest the fact that nature has a price tag, that this price tag has to be translated into action, or that has to prevent certain activities from happening. And I think if we don't manage to do that anytime soon, we will continue to speak to ourselves.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Ruppel. And I think, you bring in an interesting point about the necessity of putting a price tag on nature. And at some point in the discussion, I'd also like to bring in the question on as to can we and how can we put a price tag? What are the various mechanisms that are available? But thank you so much for touching upon that. And with this, I'd like to pose the same question to Professor Cosmin Corendea. So, Cosmin, if we could hear your initial thoughts on this.
Yes, thank you, Arpit. Well, of course, all the colleagues were right in what they were saying, and I will not argue with any of them. However, I would like to add 2 points, and one will be a rhetorical question for us all to think when we are actually distributing the financial support to countries. And I'm referring to how can you calculate or how can you measure how much money a life means? Or if we're all talking about non-economic losses and damages under Article 8, that's stipulated in the Paris Agreement. So I totally agree that money do not solve all the problems. At some point in time, we have to do which was already done under the Paris Agreement and continues apparently, and this is my second point, it's called a compromise, a legal compromise on how to actually divert money in the way that most of the countries which are most effectively by climate change, especially the vulnerable ones, are actually satisfied at some level with all the financial support they are receiving, and it works fine for them. I must say that for many countries, the financial support they are receiving through climate finance is actually representing quite a lot in their contribution to adapting and addressing climate change impacts. But more than that, without that financial support, which is coming their way, most probably those countries would have been in much more trouble than they already are. So.
Right.
Thank you, Cosmin. I think that's a very good point, and that also alludes to something that we will come to our in latter half of our discussion about what is the ultimate value of life, and can you put the same price on the life of a tiger when it is the last of its species versus when it's one amongst 1,400 and something tigers that are left on the planet. So those are some of the questions that do come up when you're strictly thinking in terms of cost-benefit analysis. And again, some really good points raised there. I would like to move on to another very important facet that also transcends from the first question, which is the whole issue of commons and public goods. And we have seen over the past at least the past decade, that there's a rising trend, judicial trend, where rights of nature are being provided to rivers, rights of nature are being provided to mountain ranges in Bolivia and Ecuador. And versus that point of view is also this intensification of property rights, because property rights can also be seen as a means to protect environment. And so there's privatization of commons on the one hand, where you allot wards to that commons, and there's publicization of commons, whether that be through public trust doctrine, which has been adopted across countries, or giving the government the right to control a specific natural resource as its trustee. So how do we strike a balance between basically public goods and market or private players to care about them, or the government to care about them outside its specific deliverables? Professor Voigt, if you could just quickly touch upon that, the whole conundrum between privatization and publicization of natural resources.
Yeah, it's a fascinating topic, and a really interesting development, as you alluded to, with recognizing rights of nature in different countries, primarily by courts. It's not necessarily in the laws, but it's by the spoken law by courts. Just some general remarks to start with. I personally don't believe that privatization is the answer to the problems that we are seeing. Quite the opposite. They may actually be causing more problems. But we do have a lot of private property, and in many cases the right to property is not connected to any particular duties. It's a right which seems to be isolated from a duty. And I think recognizing that holding property rights also comes along with duties to the community, to the environment, is really important. And in some jurisdictions that is more pronounced than in others. Another aspect is that we urgently need governmental interventions. I think it's really important to have concrete laws and regulations of what you can actually do and not do in certain areas with certain environmental goods, whether they're common goods or whether they're actually private goods. But governmental interventions is going to be very important, especially in that global transformation, that systemic change that we are needing, that we need to see within the next 10 years. We have a decade ahead of us where things really need to happen quickly and in a sustained way. And finally, this aspect of rights of nature, I think it's really important development, but of course the question is the balance. You know, as you said, how to strike the balance, because you may have rights of mountains, rivers that then have to be balanced with rights of developers or whoever has an interest. And I think this is going to be a very interesting exercise, which currently is done by the courts, but I think it has to be removed from the courts, or the burden has to be taken off the courts and put into to good and solid legislation.
So, thank you, Christina. And actually, with your call to government action and also, moving it out of court, I would also like to go back to Oliver and ask him, because when Oliver said that, we'll probably need carrots and sticks, and you seem to be in agreement that the governments need to take it up, then the question arises that, for the governments, the sticks are always going to be less expensive than the carrots. It's easier to put a penalty on something or put a Pigouvian tax on something rather than incentivizing, because that could be really costly. So would you think that that is probably going to be the way to go from here?
Well, it's a difficult one. I mean, if you want to publicize or communalize private rights and interests, or if you want to privatize communal interests and transfer those into private obligations, then this is a little bit like oil and water. And we experience that difficulty in many jurisdictions in different manners. But no doubt the need to address this in the context of property owners' obligations linked to the land, to the soil, that is also an element that in terms of carbon capture and storage is crucial in the context of climate change. It has to be communalized to some extent, but not only the penalization and the obligations thereof, but also the benefits there too. And if, for instance, the government is capable to generate revenue from, say, carbon tax, then of course there has to be a backflow to some extent. You cannot expropriate, at least in my understanding of a properly functioning jurisdiction nowadays after the fall of the Iron Curtain, you cannot deal with this problem on the basis of expropriation. The attempts have been made and they haven't been successful. So you have to create ownership in order to attract ownership also with regards to obligations. And then you need to incentivize that also to an extent. And I'm not an economist, but I think there must be a formula that can assist in this process.
Right. And, you know, let's talk about, you know, there are certainly, you know, selective incentivization that's needed from the government side. And you also seem to agree that there's a lot of need for communalization of a number of resources. But then I would probably still think that there's a huge role for the private sector to play. But you know, if I were to ask, and you know, maybe John can also John can respond to this, that how do we get the private sector to care about global commons, about public goods, because that's where the market typically fails. So yeah. John.
Oh, if I had the answer to that question, we would be so much further along. But let me just share a couple of thoughts. One is, as was suggested, by turning some of those public goods into private goods. And in that sense, I think I'm a little bit less skeptical of private property ownership and private rights than Christina is, though I'd be delighted to debate the issue. And it's not because I am somehow ideologically attached to the notion of private property rights, but because I see that, or I believe I see that in practice, individual ownership or private ownership of goods leads to their better long-term management and takes away some of the incentives for short-term exploitation with no consideration for the future of and the long-term sustainable management of those goods. But I just want to touch briefly on a concept that I think is interesting and that I would like to see adopted, whether in this form or in some equivalent form, more internationally. And there has been several remarks already about the idea that ownership comes with certain responsibilities. In that sense, the US law, which God knows has many issues and many problems, has an interesting approach to property rights that I think is worth highlighting. And under the common law of the United States and of England, if I understand correctly, there's the concept of the bundle of rights. And property is understood not as being the absolute right to do anything over which there are property rights, particularly when it comes to real property. But ownership of property actually implies a series of relatively distinct and, in many cases, separable rights, whether it is to use or to develop in particular ways, or to use in a manner that may impact other surrounding property owners. And if we could just make the notion that ownership comes with the response, with the right to use, exploit, to take advantage of, otherwise derive economic value from that which is owned, but which at the same time comes with a certain stewardship obligation, and does not give the owner the long-term right of doing away with those goods, I think we would all be better off.
So stewardship becomes a primary thing over here.
I think that also raises a very, very significant point. And I'm just delighted that I'm getting to ask Cosmin this question, because I know that he's worked on this specifically. First of all, just to cap off of what Dr. Voigt, Dr. Ruppel, and Dr. Tobin have mentioned, there's been privatization versus communalization. And I mean communalization in the form of public goods and maybe government control there. There's also, I think from what John also discussed, there's also maybe a distinction between ownership, private ownership versus private possession of those rights. So while you possess that tract of natural resource or land, to put it simply, you might not own it so as to absolutely destruct it. So you're then becoming a trustee to the land, even as a private owner or a private possessor. That's an interesting concept. And Cosmin, your views on that, and also your views on what Oliver very, very eloquently put earlier, that he kind of devised a relation between carrots and sticks. So there's sticks could be, say, a carbon tax, and carrots could be a cap and trade or an equity-based model. And maybe that's the global phenomena that we're heading towards. And then there's this inherent issue between precautionary principle, which is, say, a cap and trade versus a carbon tax, which is polluter-based principle. So that also leads us into a very interesting discussion on how that government and communalization model is working globally.
Well, that has a lot of variables. I mean, the question is, I don't want to split in Annex 1 and non-Annex 1 countries, but especially the developing countries, they don't have a carbon tax. They can't have a carbon tax. So this ownership of governmental ownership is quite limited. And if you go a little bit further to countries where the land affinity, in particular the private land affinity, is quite high, and this is in particular, in general, referring to Asia Pacific, we're going to see that even replicating the private rights, it's quite complicated. And it's quite complicated in the example of, for example, we have already 36 million people subject to relocation due to climate change. So these people need to be relocated at some point very soon, mainly because their resources are finishing, the adaptation methods are not there anymore. So this is a governmental owned process where at some point in time, they have to reflect the rights of the property at the new destination. So if they were owners at the source, they have to become owners at destination. How we can replicate if one of the lands at source had access to some kind of natural resources and the destination doesn't. So this is when it's becoming very complicated in this transfer of ownership from private to government and so on. And we also have the other example, the opposite example, where the governments are actually transferring the private ownership over natural resources. And here I'm thinking about the countries in the Sahel and the West Africa, where actually private companies started to administrate and more than that own literally water resources. Water limited resources to vulnerable communities who are facing a tremendous water scarcity. So again, one way it does not necessarily flow the way we see it, and the other way is absolutely unacceptable if we are referring to people and we have a human-centered approach when we have to look at the people in regards to their necessities. So again, I don't have a solution of that. As John was saying, I don't own a solution to that. But however, I think a balanced private/public ownership and carefulness, very careful with when addressing the property rights, in particular the private rights over land.
Christina, do you want to come back on what John or Cosmin said about the role of the private sector in here?
No, it's okay. I'm not against property rights per se. I'm skeptical against privatization of communal aspects. And when it comes to property rights, I completely second John on that it has to come with responsibilities and obligations.
But how do we create those responsibilities and obligations? Is it something that just develops in a culture, or again, are there some sticks or carrots that are needed to create
also
that?
To add to what you're just saying, Arpit, and also going back to John, did you want to respond to that?
Well, yeah, I just wanted to touch on a couple of points very, very briefly and in passing, Ishan, and then I'll pass it back to you. But in reference to that, I wanted to supplement what I said a couple of minutes ago by adding there are other ways to get the private sector to care about public goods that I didn't allude to. I focused on property rights, but the potential effectiveness in terms of changing private sector behavior, in particular that of large corporations, and this works well with multinational enterprises, best, much better than with SMEs, is the underappreciated role of reputational risk. And I can say that firsthand from having spent nearly a decade managing reputational risk for a financial institution. And it is, and perhaps my former employer may not appreciate my raising this point here, but the fact is, particularly financial institutions are much more sensitive to reputational risk than is often appreciated outside of the private sector. A business such as banking, which is built on trust, because unlike, say, the purchase of a pair of athletic shoes, which is a one-time transaction, the banking services that we receive from financial institutions are based on the notion that I am going to hand over my wealth right now, and they are going to hand it back to me 10 years from now or whenever I happen to need it. And that is an entirely different level of trust than that which you find in most commercial transactions, okay? Trust is absolutely crucial. Belief in the institution, as much as it is fashionable to speak poorly of banks, we all trust them, or at least those of us who have any form of banking relationships. And in those sorts of industries, the fear that makes its way all the way to the very top of the organization and that keeps up many, many people within the institution awake at night is what happens if people start losing their trust in us. So reputational risk.
Thank you so much, John. Oliver, did you want to come in there?
Yeah, I would just like to compliment that. In many common law countries, you have the principle of public trusteeship entrenched in the public trust doctrine. I think that is something that can well be utilized also in a sense to create stewardship, in a sense to what Ishan said, to either own or possess or utilize private property in the interest of the more global or at least national community if you translate this obligation into that trusteeship model. And in terms of industrial engagement and alignment, I think environmental, social, governance issues are becoming more and more prominent. I mean, the concept of corporate social and environmental responsibility, if you want to sleep at night, then these are to be taken into consideration, because that is, so to say, a new benchmark measurement apart from the revenue generation as such. And I think if you complement that to what has been said, these concepts can create a lot of motivation, because the immediate cash flow may not be affected, but what comes thereafter very much. And even in terms of, you know, fossil fuel companies, many of them have started to appreciate and to realize that this is the way for the future, notwithstanding the product they generate. But if you want to go into alternative markets, you have to consider especially the responsibilities that you have over what you produce.
That's actually a great point, Oliver. I mean, just to bring home the point, it is said that the most cancer research is funded by tobacco companies. So there's a bit of a making up for what you're losing out on because of my actions that is happening there. But just to carry on the point from what John mentioned of reputational risks of the private sector, let's move on again. As I said, we'll be having prismatic views and we'll be having bird's eye views. So I'll want to go to Cosmin with this. From national risks to international risks, from national trust to international trust, Cosmin. When we look at concepts like the Earth Overshoot Day, where, you know, it is assumed that Earth is basically running out of its biocapacity. By this year, it ran out of its biocapacity through exploitation of natural resources by the 22nd of August. Last year, it was 19th of July. Before that was 14th of July. So we are running out of our natural resources, which should have been spread over 365 days, about 6 months in advance. And the liability is different for different states. So from what I understand, the ecological footprint versus biocapacity, India stands at 173%, US stands at 122%, China stands at 278%. However, countries like Canada, countries like New Zealand are actually in the deficit. So they're helping with the residual of their biocapacity to substantiate what other countries are overexploiting. So how do you then come up with a regime, as we've seen in the Paris Agreement that you've worked on, as we've seen in the past on all of these international organizations, with a regime that maybe there's a case for equity-based solutions, maybe there's a case for as a country, me saying that, you know, I haven't overexploited the natural resources, so why should I cut down on any of my pollution mechanisms? And how do you build that international trust in the global space with everyone mistrusting each other?
Well, this reminds me very clear about Kyoto Protocol Phase 1, and where the carbon emissions trading schemes were very popular, and we had such a high price on carbon unit. And all the countries apparently they were keeping their cap of emissions, mainly because of this trading of under the clean development mechanism, for example, doing projects in non-annex countries and benefiting of polluting more if you are of emitting more carbon in Annex 1 countries. we don't know how Kyoto Protocol actually ended, because apparently it ends this year, and we can't, but we have some kind of measurements in regards to its success. And the success is measured differently. The success is measured differently in the countries which were the most, benefited the most from this trading scheme, which can be applied in the scenarios you are actually mentioned, but also from the countries which continued actually to exploit and to continue to contribute to carbon emissions on the same rate as they did before, based on this exchange which existed at that time. And then you have the, if you want to bring up the state sovereignty principle, then all the countries which are not there yet in over-exploitation, whatever kind of exploitation we are talking here, they would probably say that this is enough, and we're gonna keep our share of the pie for us, and we're gonna try to take care of that as much as good as possible. But that's not neither another solution, because this individualism was never helpful in our history, at least our recent history. So the top-bottom approach, which was already existing and coming from these international organizations through these international treaties, agreements, and conventions, and always somehow being misapplied or misinterpreted at the community level in the less developed countries and the developing countries, apparently was not a solution. The enthusiasm which went up to 2015 December in the Paris Agreement, we see that the enthusiasm and the momentum which was created at that time evaded slowly and disappearing. And then we have a new approach now in regards in particular to policy development, which is this bottom-up approach, where these small initial beneficial countries are actually starting to take care of their own environment, biodiversity included here. So yeah, I think that will be the next step.
Absolutely, Cosmin. I mean, like, it's in your response, you've basically also summed up what happened with EU and the positive reinforcement of Kyoto Protocol within the European nations, and then maybe now what is happening with countries like Ecuador and Ethiopia and Costa Rica, which are becoming, you know, the sort of the flag bearers of the bottom-up approach. Christina, I'd like to come to you with this. And I'd also like to play, and I do apologize for playing the devil's advocate here, but there are certain countries countries like Russia, countries that are closer to the poles, which will see a rise in agricultural productivity, human productivity, as the temperatures rise. And so there might also be a negative impetus on some major nations, large nations, to actually work towards achieving a sustainable environment in the long run. And I'm talking strictly as a devil's advocate. I request all the attendees not to judge me for bringing up this point, but this is one of the misincentives that are available to some of the countries to actually carry on the way they have been carrying on.
Yeah, well, I mean, the example you mentioned is one. There are others that are maybe even more pronounced. But of course, I mean, the science of climate change is complex. You know, we may have some positive effects in some parts of the world, but they are pretty fast and pretty significantly neutralized by negative effects. And climate change is a global issue, and we cannot be ignorant of what's happening in other parts of the world, as Cosmin has been alluding to throughout this talk, just because, I mean, even for Norway, agriculture may benefit for a while because it's getting warmer. It's not just Russia. We are pretty much in the same level, but there are so many negative aspects to it as well, so that that is something that is not falling into the overall calculation. But with your question about, you know, what is the structure, where should we go? I think that there are two things I would like to say also a little bit in response to what Cosmin said. One thing is that I do not subscribe to the statement that the momentum around the Paris Agreement is fading. I do not think that we've ever heard China saying that they are going carbon neutral by 2060 without the Paris Agreement. I think this is absolutely crucial for all the positive developments we're seeing worldwide in terms of climate mitigation. They're not enough, there should be more, but I think we would have much less without the Paris Agreement. So discrediting it, I think, is shooting ourselves in the foot. And in terms of where should we go, what kind of processes work, I think what we've seen with the Paris Agreement and now also with the post-2020 global biodiversity framework on biodiversity is that setting global targets and trying to allocate them to singular countries doesn't work. We just don't have that top-down methodology, not even the political will, but not the methodology either. There are no parameters in place that could, be used to exactly say how much each country should reduce its greenhouse gas emissions or conserve biodiversity. There are always different parameters and you come to a different result. So the only thing that seems to work is setting global goals, like the direction of travel that we have in the Paris Agreement with well below 2 degrees. And those new targets are now being negotiated under the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. And then setting in motion processes that are synchronized, that take everyone on board on a stepwise manner, that rely on peer pressure, that also rely on stock takes at particular moments in time where everybody gets together, looks at each other and says, where are we, where we need to be. These self-enforcing and self-dynamic processes, I think, is how the world is being put together these days. And I think if civil society, if research, if voters, if the electorate is behind it, these can actually be very powerful processes.
So we just got done with the presidential debate today in the US, and that makes up for an interesting discussion altogether. Probably we'll have to have another panel session altogether to discuss the implications of the debates and on the global scale. Arpit, you were saying, please go ahead.
But I would say, Christina, you bring up a very important point that, you cannot allocate those targets top down and, give it over to countries to implement. That's probably not just a realistic way of doing it. I would want to go back to the initial discussion, a point that Christina, that you raised, and if Professor Tobin could throw some light upon that you said that, it's important to see where we are spending money, and, it's also important to stop, spending money in some spaces, and which puts the onus on the governments. My question to Professor Tobin is in regards to the report on financing nature of the Paulson Institute. And I know we've discussed this briefly before, but then the report is quite critical of governments spending money on agricultural subsidies. And my question to you would be that, can we put a blanket critique on agricultural subsidies? Is it that all agricultural subsidies are bad? Or are there, subsidies, for example, subsidizing organic agriculture, which doesn't use so many fertilizers, etc.? Do you think those subsidies are, tenable and they should be all right?
You have answered a question I had about the report as we were drafting the report. And that question that I had was, are we being clear enough about where we stand on the subsidies question? Because I know this is a highly sensitive question. It is one that many jurisdictions around the world feel very strongly that others should not get involved in, at risk of appearing that they are violating the sovereignty of these countries. It's a sensitive issue. And the point that we were trying to make, but apparently failed to make clearly enough in the report, I'm seeing, is that we take a neutral stand in the report as on the question of subsidies. And this is something that I feel personally strongly about, because I was the one within the sort of a little broader working group that was developing this report, the person who was pushing this the most. We, as the authors of this report, who want to be read and we want to be accepted without developing antibodies immediately amongst a significant chunk of our readers, we need to be very clear about the fact that it is not for us to pass on whether ag subsidies and other subsidies relating to natural resource industries are good or not. The point we were trying to make is if you, for whatever internal, political, social, in many cases, completely justifiable reasons, you feel you need to deploy subsidies to maintain certain cultural values or certain politically important groups, for whatever reason, then please do so in a manner that is supportive of biodiversity and not destructive of biodiversity. Because if you look at subsidies, particularly in agriculture around the world, you find that many of them are designed in a manner that does not consider long-term impacts on nature, that does not consider long-term impacts on climate. They are the emphasis of the legislation and regulations that put these or implement these subsidies policies is very sort of socially supportive, but biodiversity negative in practice. So we're not saying subsidize more or subsidize less. We're saying subsidize whatever you think is appropriate, and it's none of our business to tell you how, rather, to what extent you need to use subsidies. But if you use them, please do so in a way that is more consistent with the long-term conservation of biodiversity.
Thanks, John. That's great. Oliver, did I see you? Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Ishan. This is an issue that I have to now advocate from an African perspective, I'm afraid, and also having held one of the chairs of the World Trade Organization, I think countries should increase efforts in the international architecture of agriculture to, under the WTO, develop more green trade agreements, in fact, that acknowledge climate change, that incentivize increased trade in commodities that are produced without negative externalities, without conversion of natural habitats. And I think that those subsidies have to be less harmful. And I don't agree that it is the sole discretion of some in the developed world to decide over the fate of the global interests in this regard. And I know that the WTO is obviously not an environmental protection agency either. And I acknowledge the state of multilateralism that we currently live in. And I see that we're moving towards more bilateral relationships. Nevertheless, I think this is crucial. And in terms of new markets, like for instance, the African free trade, continental free trade area, there may be some game changers ahead that, especially in the agricultural sector, need consideration on the way ahead.
Thank you, Oliver.
I think we're agreeing, Oliver, is that correct? Or did I misunderstand your message?
No.
I mean, even if there was disagreement, this is also the right segue to inform all of you that we have run out of time for this panel discussion. So if there were any disagreements, we'd probably implore you and probably figure out a way to regather all of you and probably have another panel discussion in the coming months. And I do understand the physical and the online constraints of having the kind of stalwarts of their own expertise that we have today with each other. So thank you so much. Thank you, John. Thank you, Oliver. Thank you, Christina. Thank you, Cosmin. It was an absolute pleasure, and I'm sure I would, and a lot of our participants would go back and have a look at this recording again, because it was full of so much information and quality discussions that we'd love to revisit everything that was discussed. Again, it was a pleasure having you, and we will hope to have you all under the same roof once the pandemic is over, and probably carry on with the discussion as well.
Thank you very much, Ishan. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for organizing it, Ishan.
Thank you, Oliver. Thank you, Christina.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye.
So Arpit, I think we will carry on with the discussion and
Yeah.
we'll invite
With this,
our other panelists.
absolutely. With this, we'll move on to our second segment of today's discussion, where we are joined by the GPODS fellows. GPODS is the Global Policy, Diplomacy, and Sustainability Fellowship that Envipol, Global Policy Insights, the UN South-South Cooperation have come together to start. We are joined by 9 of our GPODS fellows from different parts of the world to discuss about a very important topic. And the topic that we are discussing today with our GPODS fellows is around sustainable transport. As we all know that with the pandemic, transportation, which was already a challenge, a contributor because of its emissions, it was a great contributor towards global warming. Now we know that with the pandemic, it has become an even bigger challenge than it was, because now the capacity of public transportation is overburdened. You cannot possibly carry as many people as you could earlier on a public, talk about a metro, talk about a bus. But there are other aspects which are emerging, which even in these troubled times, bravely claim to bring efficiencies to public transportation, and in general, produce ways or suggest ways to be able to control the emissions and at the same time make mobility more accessible, more efficient. So today we are joined by our GPODS fellows from all across the world. We are joined by Charmi Shah, Shivangi Adani, Trija Kundu, Nupur Sharma, Caroline Saeed, Himaki, Shashank, and Palash. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. What we'll do, rather than us going into each of, rather than me introducing everybody individually, what I would do is that I would throw a question, and then we'd have your opening statements. With those opening statements, I would request that you could probably also introduce yourself, tell our audience where you're joining in from, and very briefly about your background, and then also give your opening statements. I'm also joined by my co-panelist, Mr. George Das. George is the convener of the GPODS Fellowship, and George will be opening the panel discussion with the initial prompt, and then give it over to our fellows for their opening remarks. So over to you, George.
George, you're on mute. Yes, you're on. Now you're on mute again.
George, you'll have to unmute yourself.
Yeah,
yes.
I think it's working now.
Yeah,
it is.
Perfect. So today we're going to talk about sustainable mobility. And as we know that it's one of the greatest challenges that we are facing in this century itself, wherein people and their infinite network of public transportations and private transportation that we are using in our day in and day out lives, we would include the segment wherein and have a discussion with regard to the sustainable mobility that we can opt in as individuals, as well as even the governments need to support and there should be a policy change which could help us in our sustainable mobility for the future segments.
Sure. So I think the way that we should start is that I'm gonna pose this question that it's a general question, but what do we think is going to be the future of public transportation, especially given the kind of pandemic that we are seeing? Do you think that there are innovative ways to deal with this right now, or is it going to take maybe years to come up with a solution where people are able to be mobile and at the same time not harm the environment through increased emissions? So that's going to be a general prompt to open with, and I'm going to open it with, I'm going to ask Caroline to start the discussion. And Caroline, if you could kindly unmute yourself. Briefly, please introduce yourself, and then we'd like to hear your opening thoughts.
Sure thing. Thank you, Arpit. Thank you, Global Policy Insights and Envipol for having us all here today. I know all of my colleagues through the GPODS Fellowship are really excited to be here. So I'm from New York, New York. My family's originally from Poland. I graduated Harvard in 2018 with a degree in anthropology and have since been working towards promoting the Sustainable Development Goals in all sectors, all aspects of my life. I have an incredible passion for SDGs 11 and 13, which are sustainable cities and communities and climate action. A lot of my initiatives tend to center around the youth empowerment aspect of those Sustainable Development Goals and how to use them to contribute to shaping policy as well as creating sustainable development solutions within their communities and contributing to their local economies. So I think everyone right now knows that COVID has provided us with such a unique opportunity to consider humanity's impact on climate change. And at least for me, I've been able to take a step back and say, okay, here's what worked in our communities, here's what didn't. Here's how we can try and make it better proactively to make sure that we don't go down the same route as we're starting to return to work. And we are starting to return to work, at least in the United States. So some things we have to consider, again, sustainable cities and communities. What are the chains that contribute to that? So consumption and production, how do we monitor that and partner with small business owners, local farmers, and big corporations to make sure that all of this is done sustainably and responsibly, and that we as consumers are also consuming responsibly and proactively checking that, okay, well, the entire chain has been vetted and sustainable and that we are doing our individual parts. I mentioned earlier youth empowerment, making sure that youth have an active role right now, because youth will ultimately be the ones who have the most to lose if we continue this business as usual model that we have been using for the, ever since the Decade of Action, the 2030 Agenda was launched. We're still doing the same thing. Times are now to change. So youth will be at the greatest disadvantage if we don't start changing. And I think making youth and young professionals an active part of that dialogue is something that we absolutely need to do. And whether it's creating specialized jobs for them to contribute based on their particular skill sets, or empowering them with the quality education and skill sets needed for them to become their own entrepreneurs, come into their own role, and basically pursue this passion on their own, because their communities won't listen, so we'll make our own seat at the table. Pretty much all of this to say, you need to work together, you need to be conscious, environmentally conscious and community conscious about the decisions you make, especially as we start returning to work during this time. It is possible, it's going to be a transition period, patience will be needed, and a lot of multi-level support and partnerships will be needed in order to achieve this, but it is possible, it is not too late. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Caroline, for that hopeful message and also the call to arms for the youth. I would move to Nupur to give her opening statement. Nupur, over to you. You'll have to unmute yourself.
Yeah. Hey, hi everyone. Happy to join this session today. I'm joining from Jabalpur, Madhya Pradesh, India. But currently I'm a student at UCL pursuing Masters in Public Policy. So I begin with talking about the significant challenge that we are talking today is about sustainable mobility. The thing with sustainable mobility today is that we have the solutions in our hand, unlike the current COVID pandemic, wherein we are still finding the vaccination. We have the vaccination for climate change. And there are a lot of alarms being raised about why sustainable mobility is important. However, that the sustainable mobility requires to be coupled with an idea of two more things. That is, we have a lot of solutions for sustainable mobility, but they are very fragmented and very less number of them connect to the already existing public transport. For instance, there's still a deficiency in allowing the users of the transport to make an easy transition from an e-bike to a public transport like an underground.
Right.
And secondly, we have attached the importance of sustainable mobility only to the environmental sustainability. And in my opinion, the solutions towards sustainability should cater to the broader vision of last mile connectivity and to all the sections of the society needs to be taken into account, especially the disabled and the women, keeping in mind the different cultural contexts they are coming in.
So that's an interesting point that you raise about accessibility and equity also being a core aspect of sustainability. And that's something that we should certainly touch upon when we get into our discussion phase after the opening statements. But now I'd like to invite Shashank. Shashank, if you could introduce yourself and give your opening statements, please.
Hi, everyone. I previously met a few of you before in the previous session. But here goes. So I'm Shashank, joining in from Lucknow in Uttar Pradesh. I am a politician, a full-time politician, plus I'm a social entrepreneur in the field of education, as well as a policy enthusiast. I've served in the government, working with the National Advisory Council and headed the National Program for Urban Homeless with the Supreme Court Commissioners. Just like Carolyn, so we have something in common. We are both Harvard grads, so graduated from the Kennedy School and hold a PhD economics from IIM Lucknow. So that's the credentials part of it. What today I would like to kind of highlight, right, with an example, is 2-3 things, right? Firstly, the holistic nature, like you just do a simple Google search, right, on sustainable mobility, right, and you would realize that everybody's talking about electric vehicles and all of that, right? But nobody thinks about, right, just to tell you the interesting perspective, that yes, about 28% of PM 2.5, right, comes from vehicular emissions, right? Now, as per the National Electric Mobility Mission Plan, India took an ambitious target, right, of selling 7 million hybrid and EV vehicles by 2020. And to charge them, there was a requirement of 79.9 gigawatt hour of electricity. But where does this electricity come from? It comes from coal-based power plants. So, right, what you save there while generating that electricity, you kind of more than offset that. So this is what I mean by the loop in all policies need to be closed. That is number one. B, we are going to also have to think about the impact post-COVID, right? And out of the box thinking that we are talking about mobility which is sustainable. What about no mobility at all, right? There is so many things that can be done online where people can actually restrict mobility rather than trying to find sustainable solutions for it. So that's one thing. Third thing that I'm going to talk about is how we democratize climate mitigation, right? It's not the job of just the UN or the government, the national or the state governments, right? Or activists or elite forums, right? Including this one. Unless and until climate mitigation, right, is taken up through small steps by every single one of the 7 or 8 billion citizens of this world, trust me, it is going to be difficult, right, by a few people sitting in the General Assembly, right? And lastly, we'll talk about some particular solutions which are pertinent to a developing country like India. So on that note, I hand it over back to you.
So thank you, Shashank. And I think you raise an important point, which also ties into what Caroline and Nupur also mentioned, that it's not just the bureaucrats or the officials sitting in high places who have a responsibility or the capability to bring about such outcomes. It really needs to go to the grassroots and to the individual person to be able to take some responsibility and come together to take meaningful action towards this. And on that note, I'd like to bring in Saeed Yunusa. Saeed, if you could introduce yourself and give your opening statements, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Sahid. I work as a wash consultant across the African region and also in different other countries in Europe. I'm currently residing in Harrisburg, in Pennsylvania, and I currently work with the Global Water Alliance as a voluntary board member. Concerning the topic, sustainable mobility, I could tell you there are a lot of promises, there are a lot of interventions to be done, there are a lot of solutions how we are responsible for the climate actions and what we intend to do. Let's look at the aviation sector. The aviation sector actually accounts for 3% of the global greenhouse gas emission. And the global transportation industry accounts for 17%, which is about 3/4 of the global emission itself. And the aviation industry promises are, one, they intend to use energy efficient aircraft. They intend to change the mode of fuels to biofuels. They also intend to be able to compensate for the carbon compensating for those that they already could not deal without. But there are capacities that are needed for calculating some of those greenhouse emissions across different countries, because when we talk about international islands, and what are government policies that are available to do that? Who is tracking that? Who is promoting that within true governments, within multinational governments, and how is that being computed to a local layman to understanding? So for me, I feel that we need more capacities and also lack of data, because the data are not there readily available. So many countries, it's very difficult to get data and to be able to know what the government is doing, whether the policy that the government is promoting is actually efficient, more beneficial. And also could say that the calculation to be able to compute greenhouse gas emission is complex. So we need expertise who are able to do that. And also awareness. Local people are currently not much aware about what the government is doing concerning mitigating climate change. So I think those are some of the key issues or problems, I would say, that are actually looping out with different countries, despite the fact that they do have some measures to actually be able to combat or promote sustainable mobility. Thank you.
So thank you, Saeed. And that reminds me of the old but still very true adage that what gets measured gets managed. So we have to figure out ways to track and collect data on how we are doing on our emission targets, or how we doing on overall sustainable development. And I think a lot of expertise and data collection ability is the fundamental foundation of taking any action towards climate change. So thank you for bringing in that aspect over here. I'd move to Himaki. Himaki, if you could please introduce yourself and also give your opening statement.
Hey all, first of all, thanks Arpit and Ishan. It was a very insightful webinar previously with them. It was really gained a lot of knowledge. I'm Himaki. I'm actually currently in Gurgaon, in Delhi NCR region, India. And I have done my graduation history from Delhi University in St. Stephen's College. And then I went on to work into two domains, which is sustainability and policy. And while working with sustainability sector, I kind of work towards the SDG 12 goal, which is ensuring that there is sustainable consumption and production. So that's been an important part of my methodology as well. Coming to the key issues here about sustainable mobility, one being in India, as it has grown in affluence, more people are aspiring towards the status symbol of owning private cars more. And the automobile industries themselves are not really plugging themselves to make sure they are able to buy more electronic vehicles. They want to buy the same diesel and petrol vehicles. So that's one, how we can change the behavior of the consumers. Because, in 2014, Delhi's ownership of private vehicles had exceeded by almost 10 to 12%. So I think changing the behavior of the consumers is one part about how we can go towards sustainable mobility. Second issue, I think, which is little a bit more small. I think it's urban freight logistics, but how you see your e-commerce delivery guys, you see your food being delivered, you have your Ola, your Uber, all on the streets, but how they have kind of given more to the congestion of the streets, and how what kind of solutions or innovation could be used to make sure this can be addressed as well, because a significant amount of traffic is generated by the deliveries of goods and trucks, and even it goes whether it's aviation industry or the shipping industry, they are also part of the urban freight contributing to this. So yeah, I think these are the two key issues which are also should be addressed in the sustainable mobility issue. Yeah.
No, absolutely, and I think one very important issue that you've brought up over here is about how Uber or some of these shared ride services are probably. I'm not sure if they are the optimal solution right now with the social distancing measures in place. So what is the way forward on that? So I think that's also, I hope we'll be able to touch at some point of time today. Now I'd like to invite Shivangi. Shivangi, if you could introduce yourself and give your opening remarks, please.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Arpit and Ishan, for giving us this platform. I'm Shivangi. I graduated in law from Government Law College in Mumbai, India in 2019, and I'm an environment lawyer by profession. I worked in a few non-profits in environment litigation and environment law and policy research. I have a keen interest, like Himaki, in behavior change and consumption patterns. And I think that is the crux of the issue. And I'd like to, with that lens, like to view the challenge of sustainable mobility, mainly because climate change is a human problem. We have the tendency to look at technology to save us, but while doing so, while making policy recommendations and measures, we often miss out or don't give enough importance to the users of a solution and implement measures in silos. For example, improving and adding more public transport can be redundant if mindsets and behaviors don't change. So I'd like to end with this question and work and discuss behavior change in depth, if possible. In a developing country like India, purchasing a car, like switching from public to private is celebrated, is a success indicator. So how can a social system like that of a developing country be influenced and encouraged to move towards public transport? Thank you.
Thank you, Shivangi, for also bringing in that consumer behavior approach. And I completely agree that in developing countries and cultures like India, it's almost considered a status symbol to, or it's a prestige issue that once you move up the economic ladder, probably that was the case in earlier decades in the United States, that once you rise up the economic ladder, you got to purchase a house, you got to purchase a car. And now what you see in many countries that the millennials are now more averse to purchasing vehicles of their own, but then there are cultures where that sort of an aversion has not seeped in. So definitely the consumer behavior aspect over here is extremely important. With that, I'd like to bring in Palash. Palash, if you could introduce yourself and give your opening remarks.
Hey, hi everyone. I'm Palash Bedmutha. I am an emerging professional in climate action and sustainability. And I recently graduated in Master's Sustainable Building Systems from Northeastern University, Boston. And my professional interests focus on environmental governance and energy efficiency and resource efficiency. So I think I would like to put forward why we need to move towards sustainable mobility, because I believe like if we have a strong why, we would certainly find how. And so I really want to highlight a few facts, one of them being So it is shocking to know that a car production takes more than 25 times of its material of 25 times of the finished actual weight of the car to be produced. And it is also interesting to note in terms of land use patterns how we have failed because the transportation energy intensity of just automobile commute to the workplace is 16% higher than the energy use intensity of the buildings. And it is really it is also astonishing to know that 95% of the times our vehicles use 70% of our urban space that is unusable therefore. And lastly, I would like to point out, like, if I or you go on a weekend trip with your family, so with every 500 meters in a gasoline vehicle, you are contributing to melting one. Well, I'm sorry, I have missed out on the sorry.
1 square meter, Palash.
Yeah. So with 500 meters of commute, with just 500 meters of commute, you melt finite amount of ice there in the cold regions. So yeah, I think like the why is very clear in front of us, and now is the time to act. Yes. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Palash. And I think, what you said also speaks very well to what Saeed had pointed out, that do we even realize the consequences or the the quantum of consequences of our actions? And it's important again, going back to what Shashank and Caroline had said, that it's important for not only, the academics or, policy makers or the bureaucrats to know about that number, but then it's also important to let those numbers seep in to the general population, and for people to really understand and appreciate the consequences of their actions. So it's important that education and communication takes its role to make some of those numbers very real in people's day-to-day lives. And with that, I'd move to Shrija. And Shrija, if you could kindly introduce yourself and give your initial remarks.
Right. Thanks, Arpit. Thanks, Ishan, for providing this opportunity to speak at the panel. So I currently work as an executive aide to Minister of State for Home Affairs, Shri G. Kishan Reddy, and I graduated from the University of Bristol back in 2017 in International Relations and Foreign Policy. So when we talk about environment, or when we talk about climate change and mitigation as a process, we often bring into perspective the question of multilateralism and diplomacy in this context, right? So given just previously in the panel session, there were talks of Kyoto Protocol, the Convention, the UNFCCC, the climate change, the Paris Climate Agreements, which we are all binding signatories to it, and how there's been some sort of a retrenchment from the global leadership, if I might say, in that sense, to withdraw from the question of climate sustainability. Bringing close, deep diving into this issue of sustainable mobility, I think it's something which India has actually caught up in terms of, or rather hasn't missed the bus, fortunately, because we have come with an ambitious EV policy. And, with the recent Delhi government announcing a host of measures like, waiving a registration fee, road taxes, producing financial incentives to consumers, I think the policy is actually which not only addresses the institutional side of things, but also brings into the issue of affordability and accessibility to it. So I think one of the panelists, I think, were mentioning about how EVs and the consumer behavior behind it. So I think a lot of consumer behavior is also part of the reason why EVs are not easily accessible or affordable to a wider net of individuals out there, because of the total cost ownership structure of EV vehicles, where it's just affordable or it's just accessible to the few. So I think if you have enough fiscal measures, and again this kind of ties into your carrot and stick approach, where the government sets in some push factors, and then you have certain pull factors to actually make this adoption of EV work in a $2.87 trillion economy, which has to maintain both equity and the status of development, hand to hand. So yeah, I mean, just to round off my point about sustainable mobility, I would like to leave you guys with a figure, and that probably would, provides us with a fodder for our next discussion, which is that around 85% of the vehicles which are run by batteries, they have a 85% higher chance of efficiency as compared to gasoline-run engines, which have a 20% efficiency. So what does that tell you? That around 15% in an electric vehicle is lost as heat as compared to the 80% which is lost as heat in an internal combustion engine. So I think the maths itself tells you the reason why we need to fast track or expedite this process of adoption of EVs. And there are different governmental measures or interventions, as people were saying, in this sense. But how do we tie in, a PPP form of, understanding to actually fast track this smooth transition into EVs? Yeah, thanks.
Right. Thank you, Srita. I think there seems to be a consensus around looking at the consumer behavior and the incentives that the government can structure for consumers by, for example, waiving import tariffs on electric vehicles and policies like that. That how do you make some of these things more lucrative or more easy on the pocket for the consumers is definitely something that the government can do a lot about. So thank you so much for bringing that aspect over here, Srija. And with this, I'll move to Charmi. And Charmi, if you could introduce yourself and give your opening remarks, please. Charmi, could I request you to please speak a little closer to the mic?
I'm audible now?
Yeah, much better. It's still a little patchy, but then yes, we can hear you.
So yeah, I'm Charmi. I am a Teach for India Fellow in Mumbai, where I'm teaching 46 students in an under-resourced community. Along with that, I'm also pursuing a course on behavioral economics by Irrational Labs. And my discussion today revolves around using strategies from behavioral economics to impact consumer behavior. I think this is something that has been a central theme around the conversation. Shivangi has spoken about it, Himangi has spoken about it, and also adding on to Shashank and Caroline's points, where they mentioned that this shouldn't only be the job of policymakers or activists sitting in this room. So through my conversation, I'd also like to
I think we lost Charmi over here, but that's one thing that I also want to discuss sometime during this. That if we want more people to not use emission-making transportation every day, probably we need to put internet infrastructure at par with the general transportation, and that should really come up government policy priorities so as to be able to A, make conversations like these easier, but then B, also to facilitate people staying home and working from there, especially in developing countries where there's ever larger workforce emerging. So on that note, I also feel that there are a lot of behavioralists in the room today, And that's nice to know that we are looking at things like behavioral economics and public participation in policy making and things like that. Now, Charmi, sorry we lost you. Did you have a conclusion?
I'm so sorry, I had an internet lag. Can you all hear me now? Okay, yeah.
Yes,
So moving ahead. Yeah, so I was also talking about different policies that are adopted by the government across the world. Some people are resorting to congestion pricing. Some people are resorting to keeping a cap on the carbon emission amounts. That all is important, but I'd also like to highlight the fact that at the end, it's the end consumers who are going to be consuming your cars, private vehicles, etc. And I'd like to provide a solution for this through the course of our discussion, where we could nudge consumers to make more environment conscious decisions for themselves.
Thank you so much, Armi. And while you were away, I was saying that it's important for the internet infrastructure to be strengthened, for more people to have conversations like these, as well as travel less to their offices every day, and thereby give out lesser emissions. Now, with that, I think I'm going to hand it over to George to probe into some of these things that we have discussed and open up the discussion in a more informal dialogue. George.
And thank you, Arpit. I was understanding the couple of points. I want to discuss a couple of points from both Shivangi, who had spoken about the consumer behaviorism, and even Shashank has started the topic with the idea that there's a need for mind shift. We need to understand the fact that for our personal usage, we are using private cars. That's true. Or we are using bikes and motorbikes over there. But there are cities which are actually doing a very interesting policy change. They are supporting bicycle lanes. They are creating pedestrian lanes for people. There's an electric vehicle policy that's coming up. There's carpooling, car sharing policy that's coming up. And it's actually the fact that Uber, Lyft, Grab, all these companies have become a huge industry in itself, providing employment, creating environment wherein we could actually share our cab with somebody else. And that reduces the number of personal vehicles on the road. Taking into account that there is a policy that is helping, the second segment that we should do is, personally, what we can do is opt in for all these options. Be it having a push bike, we could travel to push bikes or bicycles to our office spaces, even though it's not that fancy. When you have an option to take a car to your office, why would you take a bike? That's the mental block that we have in countries like India and other developing countries. Given the fact that for the last 6 months, there's a pandemic that's going on, some airlines have resorted to flights to nowhere and targeted passengers who are yearning to travel, are even ready to pay hefty amounts of money. And that's the very important thing. It helps the aviation industry to survive at a time when there's hardly any flights going around. So my question would be to the whole panel, and to start with, maybe Sasank can open with his remarks, that these flights which are being sold and lately, and they are being sold, I think in 10 minutes, 20 minutes, that's records breaking the numbers that's coming around. Do you think people should be more aware about the fact that first of all, we are not going anywhere, we're just using it as a luxury, and that also leads to more carbon emissions. We don't personally understand the fact that opting for other mediums could reduce. So luxury at a time when we have to seriously consider about reducing carbon emissions. What do you think about that, Shashank?
So thank you, George, for allowing me to answer that. Firstly, I'll take that in two parts. Yes, you're referring to the example of the Qantas flight, right? That in Australia got sold out in under 10 minutes.
Yeah.
Now, while there is no arguing to the fact, right, and there was a huge hue and cry, right? Singapore Airlines was also doing, but has subsequently cancelled. Air India was toying with the idea, right? And thankfully, some better sense has prevailed, right? So that is a typical elitist mindset, right? Like in my own capacity, right, when things were so bad and the day relaxations, the curbs were relaxed, right? Even in my limited capacity, I took my car and took a drive around, right? Because you're so bored. So there are some people who kind of got so bored that instead of a drive around, they took a flight around, right? So yes, it cannot be neither can my behavior, right, be explained right, and I polluted in my own small sphere, and while they did in a much more. It should be, we need to be much more responsible consumers, right? I agree to that. But I want to add on, George, that the discussion that we are having here, right? I have one fundamental thing to add to that, right? Especially in the context of developing countries, that flights to nowhere, right, are not really the problem, right? I would go to the extent of saying that the vehicular pollution in the cities is also a smaller fraction of the problem in a country like India, even in vehicular pollution, because there is so much traffic going intercity on the roads. There is, India still resides, right? Every 2 out of 3 person resides in villages, right? And it is a myth that now vehicles are not there. Two-wheelers are pretty much very prevalent, right, in the rural areas, right? Since I am a politician, I'm talking from that context. So everybody talks from a bubble, right? And that is the elitist mindset. India does not reside as of now, maybe by 2050 it will, in cities. And vehicular pollution, major part of it is also not emanating from the cities, right? Only 27% does. The remaining 73% comes from other parts of India. I'm talking about vehicular pollution in India, right? So maybe people from developing countries can kind of subscribe to that. And we need to think about how people cannot commute between cities on bikes or on electrical vehicles, right? Those are redundant solutions. So that is where I want to talk about railroads, right? Where typically they are 75% less in greenhouse gas emissions compared to buses, compared to trucks, right? And everything else. So we need to start thinking, right? When the mindset shift I was talking about right at the beginning is also from a consumption standpoint, but also from a policy making standpoint, that policies coming back need to be holistic, right? That no, we produce electric vehicles, great, but where do we charge them? And where does that power come from to charge them? Because coming from coal plants, poof, right? Similarly, we need to think about that in developing contexts, right? We should not think about the context around us. Look around, that India is more than cities, right? And vehicular pollution, only a small amount comes from cities. So that's one aspect that I want to add. Thank you. Over to you, George.
I think understanding from what you've said, the fact that there is still a huge amount of vehicular pollution that's happening, and maybe it's not the whole segment that we can talk about right now in this discussion, but coming back to the original topic, if we consider that even in India, if we reduce some amount of vehicular pollution, that's a good thing. I mean, we are adding something to the environment and to the whole world. So going back to the same topic, I think Caroline might have something to add to it. Caroline, can you hear me?
Sorry, thank you. You know, I think Shashank is definitely right, and investing in the railroads and making them more energy efficient, period, across the sector is something that's very important, because if individuals have transcontinental railways, that they can reach those destinations at a much more efficient and also quicker way, such as I think it's the bullet train in China, like that is super energy efficient and they're able to get there at incredible speed. Then investing in those resources is absolutely worth it. Now, if we're talking about transoceanic flights, then that's a different problem. But I think there we can use Singapore as a great case study, because Changi International Airport does a lot of sustainable practices that is also tailored to corporate governance, and also the engineers that work within the airport, making sure those functions are sustainable, making sure their crew and their airlines receive products through a sustainable chain. So again, going back to what I said, we need to be responsible consumers and producers and monitor that supply chain as it goes through. And I think that will at least take the onus and kind of the guilt off of the consumer who needs to take that transoceanic flight or even, you know, transcontinental flight. And that will at least take the onus away from us and more on the players in the different levels of private companies, such as the Chingy International Group, but also the governments, where they can work out some sort of grants or subsidies for corporations and entities that choose to invest and transition into these sustainable resources. I think that might be at least an initial approach. And like Shashank said, by 2050, hopefully, like we will see more of this happening, especially in the urban centers, but also making it advantageous for locals and rural individuals to commute into the city. Whether that be in the cities, they implement congestion charges as they're traveling during rush hour and using those funds to build such a railroad or to better the public transportation period. And also perhaps we create little side stops on the side in between locations so that people who are homeless or displaced or commuting can just have that tentative space to rest, as opposed to having to make the one-shot drive into the city and carpool with other individuals as well, of course, but one shot into the city driving and contributing to those carbon emissions. There are definitely workarounds, but I think forums like this, where we have, look at this is all young professionals, where we have young professionals contributing to this dialogue and brainstorming, soundboarding these ideas with one another. I think that is going to be so important and our biggest push in achieving this.
Thank you, Caroline. Sorry, yeah, Arpit, you want to say something?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with one aspect that Caroline has highlighted over here is that, you know, although there are flights to nowhere, we have to live with the fact that flights are not going anywhere. Like, you will have to travel through planes. That's a reality that you cannot do away with. But at the same time, that means that the airline industry or the operators can do a lot more in reducing or, you know, at least if not mitigating, then at least reducing some of the negative impact that they're having. And I would even go on to say that even they have a limited role to play, and therein comes the governments by bringing in the incentives and bringing in, you know, the policy structures to offset some of these effects, which are almost nearly inevitable in the near term. In the longer term, yes, until the time we have greater solutions, we probably have to improve what we have right now. But back to you, George.
Yeah, I think continuing with that point, for example, if somebody can travel by train, they're actually reducing 90% of carbon compared to flying to one place to another place. So for example, like going from London to like Amsterdam, you could actually opt in to trains, like bullet trains, although you may end up like taking a lot of more time compared to the flights that could be take you in 3 hours and you could be there. So coming back to the point, it's also a very personal choice and a decision that we need to invest in, because we're spending time through our different modes of communication, like commutations that we could afford to. Also, there is a cost factor that we need to counter. Like maybe, I know if we could decrease the train costs, the rail costs, then we would be able to afford.
I agree, and you know, over here, since we are talking, you work on the context, and that's related to water transportation. I know, for example, in the inland transportation routes, the United States, especially on the eastern coast, have developed that over the years to quite some extent. And in India, there's a lot of talk about developing water transportation to a greater extent. We also saw, for example, in intercontinental travel, Greta Thunberg coming to address the UN General Assembly, not on a plane, but then on on a ship or a yacht or whatever you call it. But then my question is that where do you see the potential of water transportation in reducing emissions and probably even using it as public transport in cities? Saeed, are you there? You'll have to unmute yourself.
I think you're on mute.
You're still on mute, Saeed. Now you're on mute.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much. Water transportation, it's actually very, very good mode of transportation because it helps a lot to cut most of the greenhouse gases. It's just like the train. The train and as well as transportation by ships are actually very much good, and they help to cut out the greenhouse gases. And it has a lot of possibility. Let's take, for instance, the case in the Netherlands. There's this floating city. The floating city, it helps to move houses, move a lot of people back at a time from one place to the other. And also in Makoko as well, we have, that is in Lagos, where we have people actually transmitting, they're moving from one place to the other through the use of canals, through the use of ships, through the use of some other modes of water transportation. So it has a larger possibility and it has a larger investment. And I can also tell you that private entity are actually investing more in water transportation now. Like in Lagos, Nigeria, there's what we have, what we call water Uber. Water Uber now is a means of avoiding traveling through heavy traffic on the road. So it has a large possibility and people are actually exploiting it. But one thing about it is there is no much investment in terms of the technology, using the sun, like using, trapping the solar lights to actually be able to have technology that can move you through the sea using renewable energies like tapping the wind energy or the solar energy. That's not actually being in shape, but the amount of, I mean, the consumptions of ships, technology is not quite as heavy and does not pollute the environment, considering the amount of greenhouse gases that is emitted by cars, that is emitted by flights. Thank you.
Thanks, Aid. Now, I think I just have an open question here and anybody can really take this up, which is that, you know, we talked about vehicular pollutions in cities. We also talked about water transportation, about air and ships. Now, the thing is that all of this is quite context dependent, and we do realize that not every city can have water transportation. Not every city, probably if you're living up in the hills, railroads are, not that easy to come up with, which brings in this whole question of, tailored urban design. And to what extent we think that, urban design is at the root, or not even urban design, maybe the urban-rural connects in public transportation. How do we take a relook at that? I think asking that whether we should would be a redundant question, but then how do we take a relook at that? If anybody wants to go for that.
Arpit, can I add one thing to that? Right?
Sure.
We also, right, and thank you for adding, because I was about to kind of tell you, right, it's just not the urban part, the urban-rural, right?
Absolutely.
So that is one thing, right?
Absolutely.
An additional aspect of this is that we need to see post-COVID, right? This is an opportunity, right? We've all seen the beneficial effects of COVID. I'm sorry to put it in that context, but in terms of climate, can we take this forward, right? We need to see, right, who needs to travel specifically for work, right? There are entire sectors, right? Like when in another lifetime, right, when I was an IT consultant, right, I remember being stuck, right, for ages on Bangalore roads, right, in buses which were guzzlers, right, and used to spew out tons of smoke, right? Those guys don't need to travel, right? And somehow that realization never dawned, right? And that's like,
I mean, I don't need to travel for work. I can, probably spend the rest of my working life like this. I don't need to.
All those McKinsey jet setting, Oracle jet setting, right? Going here, there, right? On-site, offshore. All that, right, can be a lot of it, right? E-schooling, right? Children commuting daily, right? My kids right now are learning fabulously, right? And that is where, again, there is an urban-rural divide, right? On have and have not divides. But at least those who can actually try not traveling, right? So adding on to your point of urban planning, right? Urban-rural planning, and also planning who commutes, right? And the work planning, right? So that's my
absolutely.
So, I think I think continuing on that point, there's also a segment of a population who needs to travel. There's factory workers, there's all this industries that's running, and people need to travel from their home. They can't afford to live in the business districts or the main segment of a city. For them, there is always a need to travel, and even from rural to the cities and urban cities connections, what we can also do is maybe invest in newer, better technology, cleaner and sustainable mobility, like for example, Hyperloop or any other segments. I think that would be an easier option. What do you guys have to say? I think anybody can take up the question.
Before we
can I?
Yes,
Nupur, had a point, and then
I think Ishan has a point, and then we can continue.
Okay. No, I was just saying that let's open it up. I thought Nupur had a point, and then I think Shivangi had a point, so we'll go to them, and then we'll come back to Hyper.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Currently, I mean, listening to all the arguments out here, I mean, we are talking with a lot of privileged background with us, and we are just only focusing on the environmental aspect of it and talking with a mindset of a middle class person. I mean, because the environmental sustainability needs to run parallelly with equity and affordability too, because currently in India, if you see, I can very easily buy organic vegetables and opt for organic grains. But is the same situation with the lower middle class or the subaltern classes? No, not at all. So that's the whole point of it, that when we are talking about sustainable mobility, we should not forget about the other aspects of it. I mean, and we are like really talking in an elitist sense and blaming, I mean, I also heard a lot of people were talking from the behavioralist aspects, and we are only putting the blame on the consumers. So it's not just the consumers that are to be blamed. Are we even providing them the environment to make those choices? So that's the whole point of it, because not everybody can opt for e-cycles because they're so expensive. So we need to talk in reality. I mean, we just can't copy and paste the idea from the European countries to developing and the underdeveloped countries. We need to adapt it with the local situations.
And I think
go ahead, Caroline.
I think just to piggyback off of that, Nupur has an excellent point, because what I was actually thinking, Arpit, as soon as you posed this question, it's not even what's the problem with urban design, it's that it's outdated. It was set up during a time where cities were developing, everyone was, massing to the cities to get jobs, and that is no longer the case. People can work from home. People don't have to live so close to their jobs in order to accomplish these tasks, and they don't have to be on assembly lines all day, at least in New York City. If in other countries they do have to be, then as George said, we will tailor it to them. And Shashank also said, we will tailor it to them and we will make those accommodations, but it has to be on a case-by-case basis. And I think really work with the local governments in order to achieve that, because that is just like an urban design restructural problem. I raised the point earlier about homelessness and displaced persons who actually use subway systems in New York City as their homes, and that in the COVID context not only is very dangerous because it puts them more at risk of contraction and transmission of the disease, but just what kind of a society are we living in where there's a 38-floor building, 17 of them are for rent, and all of them are not being used right now? We could be managing that so much more efficiently.
No, I agree, and even in India, that problem of homelessness, it's not talked about so much. But then urban homelessness in India, you go under bridge, a foot over bridge in New Delhi, and you'll see the real extent of the problem. Then also, I would like to just add to what Nupur said. I completely agree that what you said, Nupur, brings me back to Amartya Sen's point that poverty is also a lack of choice. It comes with if you're living in rural India and you have to go to a suburban place to work in a factory, then either you can take a fuel guzzling bus, or what else do you have? Maybe you can't travel every day 4 to 5 hours on a bicycle or a bullock cart. So there's definitely a lack of choice that comes with poverty for sure. So Srija, I see you raised your hand. You want to add to this?
Right. Yeah, I just wanted to bring the perspective on what Caroline and Nupur was also mentioning, and to your question about the urban design. So I think, Caroline, you were mentioning about restructuring of the urbanization or the urban cities because it's not been tailored to fit the changing conditions, right? But I think a lot many micro initiatives are being done from the governmental front. For instance, talking from the completely Government of India perspective, we have the Smart City Mission, which is basically providing affordable housing in the rubric of a proper environmental framework where you have a tech-led, tech-enabled green solutions for your smart housing. That's the kind of a tagline which the government sort of uses. But I do understand there are institutional challenges again, and obviously we can sort of deliberate and discuss on that a bit longer because it's a branched or it's a corollary of the sustainable the climate change that we're dealing with. But I think in terms of policies, what we need to sort of understand is there are very specific policies catering to those the bottlenecks or the problems that we have. What I think broadly ties out is how do we manage or how do we marry the policy interventions with the changing times that is there, and again that wheeling into the consumer sort of preference, because climate change is not something, and as my fellow panelists already pointed out, it's not something which can be dealt in a silos manner, in a silos fashion. It needs to integrate the concept of economic growth, development, financial inclusion, social circumstances, tech-enabled governance. It's a multifaceted thing. So how do you do that? I think that's the basic question we need to address.
Shivangi, do you want to pitch in and you have anything to add to that?
Yes, I absolutely agree with Nupur and Shashank on the points that they raised, and also answering Arpit's question on urban design and also urban-rural design. Recently, what happened in Bangalore is that Bangalore withdrew its 2031 master plan, which was absolutely flawed, and it received thousands of comments and objections. This is where the role of participatory governance comes into play, which could be incorporated in the urban as well as rural context in urban designing and structure. The second point I wanted to make is on post-COVID, who is responsible, who needs to commute to work. I think this is where the responsibility of businesses and workplaces come into picture, especially the leaders who can play an active role in designing smart and sustainable ways of allocating work and having work shifts. That's the second point that I wanted to make. And the third point, with regard to solutions, I think that whenever we speak of solutions, we can never speak of it in like a one-size-fits-all approach. If you're talking about urban context, it has to be separate. If you're talking about the people traveling by railroad, it has to be different for them. So that must always, be kept in mind. And I think taking from the previous webinar, looking at the approach is bottom up and not top down, which is generally the dialogue that, okay, let's move to EVs. But that's a top-down approach, not a bottom-up approach. So to keep that in mind when we are thinking of solutions. Yeah, thank you.
Shami, do you have something to say to it?
Yeah, so I'd just like to share a solution that did come to my mind. So right now, I think throughout this discussion, we've been talking about how railroads would emit lower carbon dioxide as compared to taking a private vehicle. But this is something, this is a dialogue, this is a conversation that we're having amongst people who are aware of the ill effects of using a private vehicle. What about the people who don't know? And this is majority of our population who actually may not have an idea. Now what we can do, like a solution that does come to mind is, if I'm traveling from place A to place B, I usually will open Google Maps. I'm going to check my time taken. I'm going to check the best route. I'm going to check my mode of transportation. For example, I can go by bus, I can go by train, I can go by car. So all the information that is given to me by Google Maps is something which is very tangible, something that I can see. But the problem with the environment is that the ill effects on the environment are very intangible. These are effects that we do not feel today. These are effects that we're going to feel over 10 years, 12 years. When you see climate change coming to action, that's when you feel it eventually, and it doesn't hit you at one point. So I think the solution to all of this is also to make climate change really tangible to our consumers. What we can do is similar to what the weather app uses on the iPhone. So for example, when it's smoggy, the weather changes, the climate changes, the display changes, and I am able to understand that, oh, the weather around me is bad. Similarly, on Google Maps, if Google Maps could also create an algorithm to give me intangible information and tell me the amount of carbon dioxide that I would be emitting if I took a particular mode of transport. So that would also tell me, that would also nudge consumers like me to probably, if I had a choice to go to choose between the train and my car, eventually, because I am able to see the impact that I am causing, because it's tangible to me, I may just nudge and move towards a public transport.
I hope Google and Sundar Pichai, who's not in the audience right now, but I hope those guys are listening to the solution, because I completely agree. The more you make it apparent from a consumer behavior perspective, the more you know how much you'll be emitting, the more informed decisions you'll be able to take. So thank you for that really innovative solution, Charmi. Saeed, I think you have something to say, and after that, maybe we can, after Saeed, we can take closing thoughts from everybody and wrap our discussion. Saeed, over to you. Saeed, you'll have to unmute yourself.
Thank you very much. I would like to add to what Charmi just said. I think there is a need to have an app, like let's say Google Map, that will also tell you the best route to take. That is going to give you a lesser, that you're going to emit a lesser carbon greenhouse gases. So this is also one best solution. Two, we understand that in most cities, it's very difficult to upgrade their urban design. But why is it not possible for government to actually bring about carpooling, to be able to provide stations that are very minimal upgrade, and to sensitize the larger public on how to be able to think smartly about climate change, how to be able to domesticate climate change in their homes. I think these are very, very important measures to carry out and design the urban landscape, which might not be possible because there are a lot of investment, a lot of capacity, a lot of knowledge that would actually be demanded by it. Thank you.
Thank you, Saeed. So now we can have our closing thoughts, and in a minute or two, let's after all this discussion, let's reflect on some of the important aspects that you thought were discussed, and if there's some way forwards for people to develop recommendations on. If we could talk a little bit about that, and I'll go one by one. I'll start again with Caroline, and Caroline, over to you.
Thank you. So I think the biggest takeaway from this discussion is you need to be conscious of your own choices. I mean, the actions that you make have to reflect your morals and beliefs. Otherwise, it's just words in the air. You need to create partnerships with the multi-stakeholders who have the power currently and can make the change. And you need to be innovative and creative in the way that we're tackling climate change as it currently is. I actually shared one resource in the chat because I forgot to add at the very start that I was a selected as a World Bank Group Youth Summit delegate last year for Smarter Cities for a More Resilient Future, and also attending a global policy and energy transition conference as well. So a lot of my work actually does tailor to these particular issues that we discussed, and I'm starting a sustainable tourism business right now. But I wanted to share 2 resources with everyone. If Aishan or Arpit, you guys could enable screen sharing very quickly, I have them pulled up.
Will you be able to do that? Wait, let me just try and do that.
Okay.
All right. I think.
Perfect. Okay.
Yeah.
So I am also part of the United Nations Association of the USA, and I think last year during the UNGA, they created this Act Now bot where basically individuals can register their individual action. You just go here and join the movement. And basically what you do is any action you take that is eco-friendly, whether it's I drank from a reusable water bottle or I used a metal straw today, you can log all that. And the Secretary General actually reviewed the report that we submitted, and I'm pretty sure we're doing it again this year. But if not, it's just like a good metric to track your own progress. And if you want to share it with your community, you know, it develops. And then the other one, I'm a climate ambassador for En-ROADS Climate Interactive. And this is an incredible tool developed by MIT and the Climate Interactive. And you can actually get trained as an ambassador. It's completely free, completely virtual. You get involved in activism very quickly. You're able to host these events using the climate simulator as well. And it really just is tailored with the goal of decreasing the temperature by 1.2 degrees Celsius by the year 2100. And you can play around with these different controls and see if that at all changes. You see the result of where we're going to be by 2100. So it's just like a multifactorial, multifaceted approach to climate action. And this can kind of help people engage in more activism, whether you want to do it individually or as a group, and kind of find your method of approach. So all in all, I just want to say climate change is still happening. We have a very unique opportunity to change it. COVID, we're coming out. We can do it. We got to be obsessed and relentless with doing it. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Caroline, for again leaving us with that positive note and sharing some of these very interesting, tangible tools, especially, you know, the second one is extremely interesting, but the first one, I really appreciate the spirit of positive reinforcement, and I think there's great value to that. So now I'd come to Shashank, and Shashank, if you could share your closing remarks, please.
Yeah, very quickly, some broad thoughts. Firstly, we need to make the climate action context local, right? It cannot be one size fit all. It will be different for different countries. So we need to keep that in context, like an Indian context, not just the urban, the rural context also. Secondly, we need to democratize the climate mitigation, right? And not limit it to just the governments or the activists or the civil society organizations or even the UN. We need to take it down to the 7+ billion citizens of the world. Third is that we need to incentivize and not demonize behavior, right? As you very rightly said, I took out my Scorpio, right? And somebody took a flight to nowhere, right? We cannot demonize people. Flights are not going anywhere. We need to incentivize people, or in Charmi's words, nudge people towards the right behavior. So that is the third thing. And lastly, COVID is an opportunity. We should use it to plan who needs to kind of go and be mobile and who can actually change the way we work. So on that note, that's the 4 key thoughts that we want to take.
Thank you, Shashank. And I completely agree with, you know, incentivizing good behaviors rather than demonizing, because that's where you probably isolate the fence sitters. So thank you for that, and also for bringing in the democratization of taking action on climate change. I think it's extremely important to talk about that. Now I'd come to Srija. Srija, if you could give your closing remarks, please.
Sure. Well, thank you for such an interesting discussion. I think bordering on some of the takeaways is we mostly talked about how consumer sentiment kind of determines the kind of policies that are already in place. And this concept of localization is something which I think will work a long way in terms of taking forward the climate change mitigation, because localization is a very important component in all sorts of policies. It's like the one side or the black size box approach doesn't necessarily lead to any tangible, and even if we take some of these best practices from countries, for instance the US, the countries in Europe, which has already done quite a bit in terms of the EV policy, but we haven't been able to do it because there's not just too much of policy uncertainty, but also because our society is probably not nudged enough to take on or commute via EV. So I think there should be a balance perspective, but there should be a balance of both consumer-led behavior and policy intervention from the concerned stakeholders. And I think that's it's something which will take forward the goal of climate change mitigation.
Thank you, Srija, again for pointing out that localization is the key to policy success. You can come up with the best of policies. Unless you don't localize it, it's not going to work. Saeed, I'm going to come over to you. If you could share your closing remarks, please. And this time you're unmuted already.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm still trying to struggle with it. I would like to say for my closing remark that localizing our discussion, we could actually try as much as possible advise governments to develop a climate smart observatory center. That will help bridge data disruptions, and we could get more access to data. And of course, people at household level could get awareness because they can easily walk up there and talk to people who understand what is going on concerning greenhouse gases, have access to information. And as well, I would like to recommend a text. It's called The Lazy Person's Guide to Saving the World. It will actually help people. It's called The Lazy Person's Guide to Saving the World. It's a very good test that will help.
Saeed, I think we lost you there. Are you there, Saeed?
It's not. Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, great.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. We can hear you. Could you repeat the last bit after the lazy person's guide to reward?
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yes, Saeed, we can hear you.
Okay, so I would like to end by that, having a climate smart observatory centers, and of course, the Lazy Person's Guide is a good test to help people understand more about climate change and how to live a smart life. Thank you.
Thank you, Saeed. I think the climate smart observatories is a great idea where, that bridges information asymmetry, and probably something that can also be taken up voluntarily in different areas of, different parts of the world. So thank you for that.
I'm not really sure how useful Lazy Person's Guide would be for some of us. So I'm not sure how useful that would be.
Yeah, I mean, I think those are some really good books on behavioral economics because, they talk about the fact that, at the end of the day, our decision making tends to be more lazy than we generally tend to think. So on that note, let's bring in Shivangi here. Shivangi, if you want to give your closing statement, please.
I don't want to duplicate efforts because I absolutely agree with everything that Shashank and everybody else have said, especially with the localization of solutions and recommendations, because that is extremely important, especially when we take from solutions that have already worked in developed nations. When we are taking inspiration from them, we have to ensure that it is extremely local and contextual. Yes. Thank you so much for having all of us.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Shivangi. I'll move to Himaki now. Himaki, would you like to share your closing remarks, please?
Yeah, so I think keeping it very short, it's very important. At earlier, it used to be said that environment is actually a luxury to a lot of people out there, and it's not that affordable. But I think over time that viewpoint has changed, and we need to make sure that because we all are together, the youth has come together and come with solutions which will make of the world a better and a healthier place for everyone. So yeah.
Thank you. Yes, I completely agree with that, that we are in this together, so we have to figure out solutions on our own. Charmi, over to you.
Sure. So I think just to summarize this entire conversation, I think one, we need to head towards a world where traveling is a luxury and not a necessity. Secondly, we also need to create new alternative methods of traveling that are more environment friendly. And the last third point is that I think even if I am traveling, I need to be aware of my actions, and climate change is something that needs to become tangible for the world.
Sure, absolutely. The only thing that I would probably add to that is that traveling is a luxury for some and a necessity for others, and we have to be appreciative of that. Nupur, over to you.
Yeah, hi. So in my opinion, restricting mobility may not one of the solutions for, sustainable mobility, because firstly, we are very generalizing the whole concept of freedom to move freely and make choices. And also by reading a lot of history books, I know like mobility has defined the human race, and you remember Ibn Battuta and all the great travelers. So I would suggest like few alternatives, like we should work on correcting these existing inefficiencies, like managing the freight transport, ensuring that the trucks are running in full capacities, have a delivery collection system which would lessen the burden of unnecessary travel for making the deliveries, and also ensuring the incentive for carpools and everything. And also very enthusiastically agree with Shashank's point on, democratize the climate change solutions and also localize the solutions.
I think picking up on that point, there is a balance that we need to find in terms of incentivizing sustainability and also bringing in other interventions to reduce congestions, or bring in new laws to licensing norms, parking penalties that would ensure that people wouldn't take their own personal vehicles and opt in for public transport.
George, in India, we cannot say that we do not have good laws. It's just the problem is with the implementation. So, now we need to focus more on the implementing the laws that are already existing rather than bringing in new laws every other day.
True, agreed. But also the fact that we have ensured and lately that we brought up a new Motor Vehicles Act and increased the penalties. So we are doing something in the law segment also. Like changing law has to be continuous process. We can't get stuck to 1980s.
Yeah.
I'm sure that would make for a great discussion during our fellowship, especially during the course that I take on comparative public administration. We should touch upon this. So last not least, I'll come to Palash. Palash, if you could share your closing remarks.
Sure. Thank you so much, everyone, for these wonderful insights. And so I really wanted to touch on one thing, that is to incentivize or promote local efforts for innovation. And I think we have pretty good efforts being put in by Niti Aayog, then Atal Innovation Mission in India. And I think we could leverage it to solve sustainable mobility problems. And in the big picture considerations, this might resonate to what everyone has touched upon. I think multimodal mix is a solution to achieving climate targets and keeping the sector economically attractive. And secondly, touching on circularity, I think this undervalued sector has a lot of potential to create more jobs, and also to ensure less extraction of material resources. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Palash. Local innovation, absolutely, that's what we need. With democratization, I think we had a great discussion here today. We will also be publishing some of the thoughts, problems, as well as recommendations in a short report that would follow very soon. We'd be happy to share it with the audience. But then with this, we come to a close of our New York Climate Week events. I thank all of the panelists to come over, share their thoughts. We're really excited for the GPODS Fellowship to start and for engaging with all of you at a much deeper level. And I would want to thank everyone in the audience who've been so patient, and that shows a lot of commitment and dedication to climate action and climate mitigation, that we've been discussing about so many facets for 2.5 hours, and our audience has been patiently absorbing all of that. So, and I'm sure people are joining in from different places and different time zones. So thank you everybody in the audience for joining in and showing us your support, and we'll keep the conversation going. Do follow our work on Envipol, and do check out the GPODS Fellowship. They are going to be doing some really great work in the months to come. So thank you.
Thank you guys. Until next time, we'll see you again.
Thank you.
So guys, I just wanted to add one more thing. And this is sort of like a metaphor for climate change. It's always, you have lesser time than you'd imagine. So we probably have to cut short this conversation when we could have gone on for a couple of hours with this. But we are also planning to have organized
I've lost him.
But maybe after the fellowship. Am I audible, guys? So we're also planning to organize a conference for our fellows, possibly after the fellowship. And that way we'll have more time to address all of these issues in better curated panel discussions with all of you getting a lot more time than we were getting today. So with that thought, again, like, thank you, Arpit, thank you, George, for moderating. Thank you all the attendees, and most importantly, thank you all the fellows for being a part of this. And it really makes our day to see all of you participate with such vigor and rigor. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.